Okay, so we're going to look at the last topic in crime. So this video is just going to go through the background, and it is going to just very briefly talk about the key piece of research as well. So the background to this topic, which is effects of imprisonment, is looking at punishment and reform as responses to criminal behaviour. So we're looking at when somebody has committed a crime, how we try to punish them or reform them. So really what you need to know is that there's two types of punishment. So there are non-custodial punishments, firstly. So a non-custodial punishment is one that usually involves somebody not going to prison but receiving some kind of punishment. So it could be that they are given a fine. So a fine is probably one of the most common non-custodial criminal sentence. Now this is usually for crimes which are considered less serious, so it could be driving, road traffic offences, littering, not picking up your dog poo, things like that, basically. You could be given a community sentence. So this basically replaces a requirement upon offenders that they must meet while they are serving their sentence. So their sentence is a period of time, and they've got to meet a certain requirement in this time. So that could be unpaid work in the community usually, so that is to repay the neighbourhood for their crimes. So it's sometimes known as community payback. You can also have a probationary period as well as a non-custodial sentence. So probation is basically a period of time where you have to report to a probation officer and there's restrictions on the things that you are and you're not allowed to do. So basically it will prevent you from engaging in any criminal behaviour, from drug taking, things like that. And you have to kind of have regular check-ins to see that you're in work and that you are, a law-abiding citizen, basically. So you can be put under supervision of the probation service during a community sentence. So you might be already doing a community sentence, but also you're under probation at the same time. Or sometimes when you are released on licence from prison, you will be released on a probationary then sentence, where you do kind of, like I say, have to have those regular check-ins and be monitored. And finally, sometimes even if you are guilty of a crime, you can be given like a suspended sentence or a conditional discharge. So that essentially means that you're not going to prison, so it's non-custodial, but actually no more action is going to be taken unless you commit another criminal offence. So for example, if we found you guilty of handling drugs or something like that, they might give you a suspended sentence, and actually you won't go to prison providing that you're not caught in relation to any other crimes within the next 12 months, let's say. And if you are, then at that point you would then be sentenced to a custodial sentence. Okay, so that's just a variety of some non-custodial things. You will have seen some other things that relate to perhaps probationary sentences, like people getting tags and stuff like that, but they're all basically non-custodial sentences. So you've been sentenced, you're being monitored in some way, you're having to repay back to the community, but you are not imprisoned. On the other hand, you might have a custodial sentence. So a custodial sentence is one where you are put into prison or a secure unit. Okay, either or. So prison sentences are usually given when an offence is quite serious, and therefore imprisoning them and removing them from the streets is the only suitable sentence to give. Now, the prison population at the moment is, well, I think this is 2019, there was about 82,868 prisoners in 2019. And obviously that's taken from a particular month in 2019. I think that was taken from March. And most of these are male, so 95% of them are male, roughly, and about 4.5% are female, and then the remaining amount are young offenders. So we do have quite a lot of people in prison, and there's about 121 prisons, I think, in Great Britain, the United Kingdom, whatever. So they are quite heavily populated, which means that actually you're only going to send people to prison if they have committed a crime where they do need to be removed from society most of the time. Anyway, that's by the by. But essentially, that's what we do. We can also hold you in a secure unit. Now, this might be if you are somebody who's committed a crime, and you may have committed a crime because you have a mental health issue, so perhaps because you have schizophrenia, and therefore a prison isn't a suitable environment. So actually, if you go to a special secure hospital, you'd be more able to receive treatment alongside, obviously, not being in the community. There's also residential centres, so that there is a picture of Feltham, which is a young offenders residential centre. So that can provide a combination of therapeutic treatments like social learning, and also some of them follow like regimes of physical training and stuff like that, you know, like as a deterrent from anybody actually wanting to go there. So none of them are enjoyable environments necessarily, is what we're getting at. And like I say, there are different types of prisons as well. So some are open prisons, where people can leave the prison for work or other things, and some are not. Okay, so there's a variety of different types as well. But essentially, if you're held in one of these units because of the crime that you have committed, that is a custodial sentence. So what we also need to consider is why we imprison people. So what is the purpose of it? So there's a variety of reasons that are the purpose, but here are a few reasons why we might use prison as a form of punishment. So firstly, punishment is the first reason. So according to the Ministry of Justice, a prison sentence is designed to punish people for the crimes that they have committed by taking away their freedom and protecting the public. Okay, and that's the last one that's on there as well. So protects the public from the most serious or frequent offenders. Okay, so if we've got somebody who is committing violent offences, then they're going to prison to be punished, but they're also going to prison because then they're going to be kept off the streets, and therefore will protect other people from becoming victims to their crimes. Additionally, the idea of justice is why we imprison people. So by justice, we essentially mean that the punishment fits the crime, I guess. So we've got two researchers there, so Lerner and Miller, who came up with this hypothesis called the just world hypothesis, and that is where the victim of a crime feels that justice has been served when the offender receives a custodial sentence, as people get what they deserve and they deserve what they get, basically. So their research suggested that people feel more kind of satisfied with the judicial system if somebody has received a custodial sentence. There's the idea of it being a deterrent, and by deterrent we mean it puts you off, so it stops people from doing things. That's what deterrent usually means. So a couple of researchers there, so a piece of research done in 1995 believes that punishment of prison serves to reduce the crime rate, either by acting as a deterrent to other people who might go and commit a crime. So if you were going to commit a crime, you would think twice, basically, because you could go to prison for it and it might put you off. or for those who have already committed a crime, it acts as a deterrent for them committing further crimes. So it acts to kind of reform you as a person and prevent you from committing further crimes. Now, prison essentially works, any of this, based upon the ideas of operant conditioning. So operant conditioning, where you learn from the consequences of your actions. So people will avoid a behaviour for which they have been punished for in the past. Okay, so if you've been punished because you've received a custodial sentence for a violent crime, then that should put you off repeating that in the future, because you've been punished for it. What some people have also said is that it does take away your freedom as well, and then that will act as a deterrent. But additionally, when it comes to acting as a deterrent, vicarious reinforcement could also be there. Vicarious reinforcement and vicarious punishment. So when you see somebody else be punished for their crime, you're less likely to imitate their behaviours. So we need to look at the effects of imprisonment. So when you put somebody in prison, does it work, or what could be the potential other effects of doing so? So negative effects of imprisonment are that many prisoners do often then suffer mental health problems, things like anxiety, depression, and in quite serious cases, delusions or hallucinations. And a key thing that's been looked at with prisoners who have been sentenced to custodial sentences is suicide. So Dooley did a piece of research where they looked at 442 unnatural deaths in prisons between 1972 and 1987 in England and Wales. Now, out of these 442, 300 of them were suicides. So they managed to get their hands on the case notes of 295 of these 300 suicides, and they did a content analysis. So a content analysis is where that data is already kind of in existence, and they just look through it to look for kind of key themes that appear. So in terms of the key themes that appear in the case studies, this includes things like statements of prison staff and other inmates, was that a high percentage of prisoners who were serving longer sentences committed suicides. Just from the ones that were selected, those who were convicted of violent or sexual offences had psychiatric contact, so in other words they'd sought mental health support. In a third of cases they had done self-harm in the past, and a lot occurred at night by prisoners who were on remand, so they'd been sent to prison but they'd not yet received their full sentence, so they were awaiting their sentencing. And why do they commit these suicides? Now, 40% of them were attributed to the intolerable prison situation. Okay, so what you have to remember is that these prisons are often kind of subject to overcrowding, and then there's other factors that then relate to overcrowding, which can mean that, you know, it's not an enjoyable environment. That it might be because of guilt for the offence, or because of a mental disorder, potentially. So what we have to think about is whether prisons are actually effective. So it is argued that the benefit for Category A prisoners, so Category A prisoners are usually the most violent, or the ones who are the most of a danger to society, is that if you lock them up for an extended period, then that would be effective, because it would mean that they're unable to go and commit further crimes. But actually, overall, only about 40% of sentences are less than 4 years, so that's nearly half the sentences that we give are less than 4 years. So that means that only 60% are more than 4 years. Okay, so actually then a lot of people were not locking them up for an extended period. So then that argument only works in 60% of cases potentially, or even less than that. Now, other figures which are relevant to how effective prisons are is that more than 1 in 4 criminals will go on to re-offend within a year of committing a crime, and that means that there's 500,000 offences between them. Recidivism rates, and by recidivism we mean whether somebody goes on to be a multiple offender, so to re-offend. So recidivism or re-offending rates are at 26.8%. So that means that quite a large amount of people who are released from prison will go on to re-offend. The biggest increases in re-offending were among juvenile females and 40 to 49-year-olds as well. The biggest falls in re-offending, so people who do appear to show that it's effective in some sense, are adult females. Criminals who leave jail, the re-offending rate increases from 46.9% to 47.2%. So actually this is showing that the re-offending rate increases after you've been in prison, not, you know, it's not actually aiding in decreasing the re-offending rate over time. The re-offending rate is increasing over time. So actually what this suggests is that the effectiveness of prisons must be worsening because re-offending rates are rising, so there must be some problem with the prison or the prison system if re-offending stats are becoming higher, and also that the way that the prison rehabilitates offenders must be ineffective, because that's the issue that they need to tackle. These major reforms are going to take place to tackle the problem of recidivism and reoffending rates. So the prisons are there to either stop you from offending because you're locked up in prison, stop you from doing it again because you've been punished or because it's a deterrent, or to stop you from doing it again because we've reformed who you are as a person. And clearly, once you get released, those things aren't occurring for most people because there's a lot of reoffending that goes on. Now we have to think about why this is as well. So it's not the case that most prisoners want to reoffend when they get out of prison. You know, they're not sat there serving their sentence thinking can't wait to go out and commit another crime. Most of the time they are determined not to return to prison. However, unfortunately, it says they're leaving a prison may mean that you're going back to a place that led them to crime in the first place, and these factors may still be likely to influence them. So, like, if you think about what you've looked at in previous topics, about social factors that can lead to offending, then actually, if those social factors led you to commit an offence and then you return to the same social environment once you emerge from prison and are released from prison, then actually surely you're going to go on to commit those same offences again. Pakes and Pakes also suggest that prison may have made things worse for them. So a third of prisoners lose their house while they're in prison, so you may come out and be homeless. 2/3 lose their jobs. About 40% lose contact with their family. So actually you may come out of prison and be in a worse situation financially and in terms of the support systems available than when you went into prison. And then actually this means that, you know, you may feel that you have no other option than to go on to commit more crimes. And additionally, it's important to think about the profile of criminals. And this isn't necessarily all criminals, but a general criminal profile. Prisoners are 13 times more likely to have been in care as a child, 10 times more likely to have truanted from schools, be poorly educated, lack basic numeracy and literary skills, not achieving good grades in literacy, numeracy and writing literacy than expected of an 11-year-old. So if you think back to Farrington's research, then actually this might suggest that, you know, you are then prone to offending behaviour, and therefore that's why you may then just recommit those crimes. So really, why do we need to reform? Now, prison as a deterrent doesn't work for everybody, as those recidivism rates show. Like we said, prisoner profiles mean it's very difficult for people to not reoffend. And also, one argument against prisons is that actually when you put people in prison, all you're doing is grouping criminals together, and then that could breed crime because you're learning crime from other people who've committed other crimes. So this is why it's important to try and rehabilitate or reform criminal behaviour so that we end up releasing non-criminals, I guess, from prisons. So if we're saying that when you are released from prison, you're going to be in a worse situation, you have a person type that means that you're more likely to turn to crime, then actually what we need to do is implement these kind of rehabilitation programs that will improve your skills or improve opportunities for prisoners, so that actually the goal is that you're less likely to reoffend upon release. So the role of prison in rehabilitation schemes is firstly, we give you a chance to work during your sentence if you're part of one of these kind of rehabilitation schemes. So the UK government has placed prisons at the heart of its rehabilitation revolution in criminal justice. So the idea behind this is that there is a development of working prisons where inmates get the chance to work during their sentence, which means that actually you might be gaining new skills. So you might be learning a new skilled trade while you're in prison potentially. It might mean that actually the idea of coming out of prison and having an unstable employment and a lack of motivation to work doesn't apply to you because you have been working, you've just been working while you were in prison, and also you don't have that lack of motivation because you've still been engaging in workplace activities. And this might mean that actually you're less likely to turn to reoffending, and you might be more likely to get some kind of skilled employment. So, like for example, you might learn how to plumb, for example, and be a plumber. And this means that you might be more successful in reintegrating into society. So there is a piece of research that we are going to look at there. You've got the researcher's name there. We're going to look at that in a second. It is in your booklet. But additionally, there are also things like therapeutic programs. So they offer things like anger management therapy and anxiety reduction. And then that basically enables us, if you are perhaps a violent offender, to find what factors trigger your anxiety, and learn techniques to calm down and deal with angry situations in a more positive way. So it's not preventing you from getting angry, but it's preventing you from reacting in like a violent or aggressive way to certain situations. So it encourages like more self-awareness, and then that might stop you from committing violent offences in the future, maybe. So a piece of research here is looking at employment within prison and the effect upon recidivism rates. So this was another content analysis using Canada's offender management system. Now, essentially what this does is it compares outcomes of people who were employed in prison to those who were not employed in prison. And it found that those who are on employment programs were more likely to remain on conditional release. So remember I said before, if you get put on conditional release, it means that you can, you might be reporting to a probationary person, but you essentially will not be going to prison unless you engage in another criminal act. So we release you, but if you are caught in relation to another crime, you'll go back into prison. So this means that they are less likely to return to custody with a new offence. So at the end of the study period, 70% of the employed group remained out of prison, compared to just 55% of the unemployed group. So this basically tells us that employment-based programs do work to reduce the likelihood of reoffending. Okay, so I'm just going to briefly talk you through your key piece of research. So what you'll want to do is just follow along in your booklet. So this key piece of research is by Haney et al. You may see it in other places referred to as Zimbardo's prison study. But essentially this was done in the 1970s. Now it was based upon the observations that the social institution of prisons continue to fail. At this time, recidivism rates were above 75% in America, and failure to reform and prevent reoffending with prisoners at this time was attributed to explanations such as the dispositional hypothesis. So this suggests that the state of social institutions are due to the nature of the people who administrate it, or the people who populate it. So because you're putting so many evil people in one place, then actually it's going to then kind of spread evil, if you will. So guards were viewed as being like sadistic and uneducated and insensitive, and prisoners were characterised as people who have like a disregard for the law. They were impulsive or aggressive, things like that. So the poor conditions in prisons and the fact that we are unable to prevent reoffending was basically being attributed to bad people, rather than bad conditions. So they were saying that it was dispositional rather than situational. Now, it's not possible to do this by doing a direct observation of an existing prison setting, because the effects of personality and the environment therefore couldn't be separated, because those people have already been in those environments. So they have had environmental effects, but also they obviously would have had individual effects as well. So you must create a new prison scenario where participants can be randomly allocated to roles of prisoner or prison guard. So this research aimed to create a mock prison that was a functional representation of a real prison and would allow role-playing participants to go beyond the superficial demands of their assignment into the deep structure of the characters that they represented, so to portray the role of a prisoner or a prison guard. Okay, so this is known as a lab experiment, where the independent variable is the role of prisoner or guard, and the dependent variable is the behaviour of the prisoners and the guards. Pardon me. Now, we gathered data on this dependent variable by looking at direct observations. So we had audio recordings and video recordings, and also self-reports using questionnaires, mood inventories, personality tests, guard reports, and interviews after the experiment was over. So the sample of participants volunteered through a newspaper advert. This was put into 2 newspapers in Stanford. The 75 respondents were given a series of psychological tests and interviews. Now these were looking at those who were the most stable, so had no kind of history of mental illness, physical disability, anything like that basically, so you were a stable individual. Okay, and 24 people who were the most stable were selected. All were college students, male, largely middle class, and they were strangers to each other, so they didn't know anybody else in the research. There were 2 reserves who were not used and 1 who dropped out, and this means that once they were randomly allocated to their conditions, we had 10 prisoners and 11 guards. So the prison was 3 small cells that were 6 by 9 foot each. Each cell had 3 what you call cots in. So by cots we mean beds. So these were just a mattress, a sheet and a pillow. There was one for each prisoner. The doors had steel bars on them, just like a prison would. There was a unlit solitary confinement facility, so a dark room where you could be put into solitary confinement. And in an adjacent wing of the building, there were rooms for the guards, a bedroom for the superintendent of the prison, which was Philip Zimbardo, one of the researchers, and a warden, who was one of the research assistants. And there was the interviewing room as well. Now, in the interviewing room, there was an observation screen at one end for video recording equipment and space for the observers, so kind of like a one-way mirror situation. So prisoners were to remain in the prison throughout the study, and the guards worked 3-man 8-hour shifts, so they were allowed to go about their normal lives at other times. So all participants signed a contract. They were guaranteed a minimally adequate diet and clothing, housing, medical care, payment in return for their intention to serve in whatever role was assigned to them for the duration of the study, which should have been up to 2 weeks. The contract also made it clear that they were not going to have very much in the way of privacy, and that their basic civil rights would be suspended with the exception of physical abuse. The guards met at a pre-experiment briefing session and were told that they should maintain a reasonable degree of order within the prison necessary for its effective functioning, and decide amongst themselves how to deal appropriately with any situation that arose. So they helped to set the prison up as well, and that helped them to kind of get ready for their role and make them feel as if they were the prisoner, like that prison was their domain. The guards believed that the primary interest of the study was in the behaviour of the prisoners, though obviously the researchers were equally as interested in the prisoners and the prison guards. Now, each group had to wear a uniform, and that promoted this feeling of anonymity. So if you're a guard, you wore a khaki shirt and trousers, so it's kind of like a military look. You were to convey a military attitude, and you had a whistle, a police nightstick as symbols of power, and they wore reflective sunglasses like you can see in the image. If you were a prisoner, then you were to wear a loose-fitting muslin smock. So a smock, it looks like a hospital gown is an example of a smock, basically. So it just goes over your head, and that's it. They were basically wearing those to make the movements awkward, and also it's emasculating is the idea. The smocks had an identification number on the front and the back, and you were referred to by your identification number, like a prisoner number, and you didn't wear clothes underneath the smock, so there was no undergarments. So that was, you were dependent upon the smock for any remaining dignity, I suppose. They had a light chain and lock on one ankle to convey oppression, rubber sandals and a cap that was made from a nylon stocking that kind of gave the impression of their heads being shaved, and they weren't allowed any personal belongings. If you were assigned the role of prisoner, then you were told to be at home on a particular day, which I think was a Sunday. The police department would arrive unexpectedly at each person who had been allocated prisoner's home, They conducted a thorough search in front of the neighbours, and then they took them away. Okay, so that was there again, just like the prison guards set up the prison to kind of make them feel like, they were the prison guard. This was done to make the prisoners feel like they are a prisoner, that they have committed a crime. So once they get to the mock prison, they're stripped naked, they're sprayed with a delousing fluid, they're made to stand naked in the yard, and then they're placed in their cell where they are to remain silent. Okay, like I say, throughout this experiment as well, they are dehumanised because they're referred to only by their prisoner number. They were served 3 bland meals a day. They were allowed 3 toilet trips that were supervised. They were given 2 hours for reading or for writing letters. They were allowed 2 visiting periods and movies a week, and they had to line up 3 times a day to be counted and also tested on what the rules of the prison were. So overall, basically what we saw was that this had an impact on the feelings of the prisoners and the prison guards and the interpersonal processes between and within, really, the role groups. So guards and prisoners showed more negative feelings towards each other and towards themselves, and prisoners expressed more intentions to harm others. The guards, remember, they were prevented from actually using physical abuse. They were told that they wouldn't be subjected to any physical abuse if they were a prisoner, so we couldn't use any physical abuse, but they often expressed aggression using verbal aggression. Now, when the experiment ended, the guards did seem distressed at their own attitudes here. So one guard said he was upset at the suffering of the prisoners. However, at the time of the experiment, none of the guards ever failed to turn up for work on time. Often they would stay extra hours, and that wasn't for any extra money or anything like that, so they were staying for, enjoyment, I guess, without complaint. If you were a prisoner, 5 prisoners had to be released early because of extreme emotional depression. So crying, rage, anxiety. One had a psychosomatic rash. So by a psychosomatic rash, we mean a rash from essentially stress due to psychological factors, not because there was anything physically wrong with him. And these symptoms started to be displayed in the prisoners as early as day 2 of this research that was supposed to last 2 weeks. Some guards were fair and passive, while others went beyond the rules to engage in cruelty and harassment. So there were individual differences between people within these roles. So not everybody who was in that role conformed to the same behaviours. So, for example, they would make prisoners clean toilets with their bare hands. They would wake them up in the night, the prisoners, for a roll call. So they would disturb their sleep as well, which can have a negative effect on you psychologically. And then some prisoners would cope with this cruelty by becoming ill, because obviously, like I say, it does damage you psychologically. Whereas others just became quite obedient to the kind of authoritative prison guards. So this experiment was actually terminated after 6 days. Now, Zimbardo at the time was the main researcher on this, and he did actually want the research to continue for 2 weeks, but it was ended after 6 days. So this decision was made because the effect of the role play was quite severe and significant on both prisoners and guards. So overall, being confined within a prison environment can have a great negative effect on the feelings of both the guards and the prisoners. It can have a great effect on interpersonal processes, so like the interaction between prisoners and guards. Prison guards develop something known as a pathology of power. So they were given kind of unchecked freedom to exercise control. And then, like I said, they were staying beyond hours, but not for any extra pay. So they were staying because they were clearly feeling exhilarated. So they were enjoying their role. And then gradually began to misuse the power given. Prisoners also developed something known as pathological prisoner syndrome. So they basically learned a means of responding to the guards' behaviour. So they initially were in disbelief, then they started to rebel, and then they kind of were very passive and had quite flattened emotions. And then some did become ill, like I said before. So the general conclusion of this is that ordinary individuals can play roles that they're given to extremes, and that there are individual differences in the way that people cope in these new experiences, but the punishment of being imprisoned in real prisons doesn't necessarily just fit the crime for most prisoners, but in fact it exceeds it. So remember, none of these people involved were unstable, they were assessed for stability, and yet actually there was significant negative effects for the prisoners and negative effects for the guards, in the sense that, they became consumed by the power. And actually then perhaps the evil situation is controlling behaviour. None of them were evil people, but actually the situation that they were put in was an evil place.